Okay, mind frame. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mensur Bacaliu. I did an internship with the Worcester Police Crime Lab as a part of their latent print unit, and I did a comparative analysis between two latent print development techniques, Lumicyano and a two-step technique of Cyanoacrylate and Rhodamine 6G. All right, so first, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to give you guys a definition of what is a latent print, right? So latent print is a fingerprint impression produced by our friction-ridged skin, which is very complicated. But in that bottom right corner, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. But the key thing about latent prints is you cannot see them without some sort of development medium, right? Because they're invisible to our naked eye. And a very important factor is they're made up of 99% water, right? Which makes them very easy to brush away, which is a big, important part of this analysis, kind of when I get into limitations and advantages. So first, I'll just kind of define what Lumicyano is. So it's a one-step fluorescent development technique that will make our, not only like give our latent print good detail, good quality, but also the ability to fluoresce under a laser, right? Which is what I'll get into in a second. But it comes with a powder and a solution that has to be mixed at either a 5 or 8% ratio. And this graph on the screen is the different types of volumes you can use because it's dependent on your fuming chamber, right? Which is basically the area where you do this technique. So we used, at the Worcester Crime Lab, we used a 300-liter chamber, which is about, so I did it at 5% ratio. So we did 2 scoops of powder and 53 drops of solution, which is as difficult as it sounds. And it works on non-porous and semi-porous surfaces. I'll touch on that more in a second. And now, what is cyanoacrylate and rhodamine 6G? So cyanoacrylate is a very popular latent print development technique that does pretty much the same thing, just in 2 steps instead of 1 step. So it kind of solidifies your latent print, so it's not going to go anywhere, and all that detail is going to still be there. And then you use rhodamine 6G as a second step to give it the fluorescent property under a laser. And this is a 2-step process, and rhodamine 6G is a dye stain, so yeah. And it also works on non-porous and semi-porous surfaces. So I want to dive into theoretical advantages of Lumicyano. The important word is theoretical. First off, it's a lot quicker of a technique. It saves a lot of time. We'll see that in a second. And when you're working in a lab, you want to be efficient, right? And it's supposed to give better quality prints. The reason I say supposed to is because in this bottom left image here of this fingerprint, it was a fingerprint on a control surface, so it was just like a non-porous surface. And it was developed 1/2 with Lumicyano and 1/2 with cyanoacrylate and rhodamine 6G. And the left side, I think, is better, which is not Lumicyano. That's why I put supposed to be better quality. But I'll leave it up to you, the audience. And smaller margin of error. There's not a lot of detail there, but smaller margin of error. So if I'm handling pieces of evidence, right, especially when I'm trying to get them developed, like I said, latent prints are made up of 99% water. And a big thing we went over in the crime lab is just how easy it is to wipe those away completely on accident, right? So if you're going from a 2-step development technique to a 1-step development technique, there's a lot less handling, right? There's a lot less margin for error. And that's really important when it comes to evidence that is trace. It can disappear really quickly. It can be gone very, very easily. And less DNA degradation. So these graphs on the right are a graph of degradation indexes for the different latent print development techniques. That first graph, I can't walk over there because I'm in a frame, but the first graph, that first bar is our Lumicyano, right? The second one is our cyanoacrylate, and the third one is our rhodamine 6G. It's very important that we realize that because it's a 2-step technique, we have to stack those indexes. So in the long run, Lumicyano degrades DNA a lot less than our 2-step process, which is very important. And that doesn't mean that it vanishes or is not usable. It just makes analysis a lot harder if you're doing DNA analysis post latent print development. And a quick inventory of the materials we used. So first off, we have a tracer laser, which is at the top there. Very important you use goggles because I can't see if I'm looking directly into a laser, right? And then our fuming chamber, that's the exact model and the exact picture of the one they have at the Worcester Crime Lab. It's really cool. Not as big as some other ones, but it'll do. And then we used a Nikon D750 with a 60mm lens to shoot, which is a beautiful camera with really good pictures that you'll see in a second. And it's important, I can't see without goggles, so the camera can't see without a filter either. So it's very important that we have a filter on that camera. And then we used a copy stand to keep the camera in place when I was shooting. And then obviously we have our products, so Lumicyano, Cyanoacrylate, and Rhodamine 6G. So my hypothesis before we get into a procedure, I believed wholeheartedly that Lumicyano would outperform our two-step development technique. Just based on overall contrast, ridge continuity, which I'll touch on in a second, and an overall level of detail. But we'll see if I was right or not. So quick overview of the procedure. So I picked two different surface types, non-porous and semi-porous, to test with both techniques, and I chose good representatives of both surface types. So a non-porous surface is a rigid surface with no pores, no crevices. There's no air going through that surface. So any latent print developed on a non-porous surface, the print is just going to stay there, right? That's why it's a lot easier to just wipe away because it's not going anywhere. And the items I used for this is a soda can, so that's aluminum. That's as non-porous as it's going to get, right? And 2 plastic cups, just to keep it interesting. And then we moved on to semi-porous. So semi-porous is a little bit confusing. So it's a surface that resists fingerprint residue, but also absorbs it. And we'll touch on it in a second, especially with the cigarette containers. But what you'll see is a lot of smudging and a lot of degraded detail because half of the print is absorbed and the other half it was resisted. It's weird. And so good representatives of this kind of surface type is like a magazine cover, like the glossy cover on the beginning of a magazine, and cigarette cartons. A big part about this procedure is that all the evidence, our mock evidence, was randomly handled before I did any development techniques. This was to keep it as practical as possible because I could have, put my fingerprints on all these items and then thrown run it through both techniques and then just get amazing data for both, but that's not really as practical as I wanted to make this comparative analysis. So first off, we're going to start with cyanoacrylate, and the total impressions is blocked, but that's okay. I'll tell you. So we found 48 impressions when using cyanoacrylate and Rhodamine 6G. That's a lot. Across our 6 different surfaces, that's a lot of impressions, right? And I separated it into 2 different columns. So non-suitable, so prints that don't have enough detail, they're smudged, they're distorted, can't use them, right? They went there. But it's very important that I still mark them down because we're looking at a quality test here at the end of the day. And then we go to, and you see a good amount of impressions found that weren't suitable. But for the most part, a lot of them are suitable. You look at this suitable graph, that's just like good detail, good definitive detail. And what you see here is a lot of the impressions we find are suitable. They're good. They develop well. They have a lot of good qualities. There we go. Oops. Oops, sorry. There we go. Okay, now moving on to Lumicyano. So we found a lot of impressions. So the number of impressions found was cut in half, right? So we went from 48 to 24. That tells us a lot, right? So first off, when we look at our non-suitable graph, we see a lot more than in our suitable graph. This is not a great sign, but still we're getting data, right? We're still developing prints, maybe not as good, but we'll get to that in a second. And then, yeah, three of our mock evidence didn't yield any suitable results, but it's okay. We'll get to that in a second. So I scored these impressions upon comparison in 2 different ways. So the first way was individual scoring, which is self-explanatory. Every latent print was scored on a scale of 1 to 5 in terms of contrast. So the print compared to its background, ridge continuity, which I'll touch on in a second, and overall detail. And then comparative scoring was just based on our individual scores, and it's a test of more or less optimal of a technique. It gets a little bit confusing, but I'll touch on it in a second. So there's a lot of words, but I'll break it down really simply for you guys. Individual scoring, we have, if you get a 1 or a 2, that's a pretty low quality print. If you get a 1, you can't use that, right? That's where a lot of our non-suitable prints come from, a score of 1. There's no detail. Oops. There's no detail. It's heavily distorted. You cannot use it for identification or comparison or anything like that. 2 is a little bit better, but not much better. You still can't use it, right? So we don't have any 1s or 2s because those are thrown under the non-suitable category. Then we get to 3, which is moderate. So adequate, you can use it for comparison. You can maybe use it for identification, but it's going to need a lot of digital enhancement or Photoshop, whatever term you like to use. But when we get to 4 and 5, those are good. Those are good, high quality prints. A 5 is you could shoot it and use it for comparison, maybe even an ID, right? But 4, there's a lot of detail. You can trace it all the way through. It's great. So we're working with 4 and 5s here pretty much. Okay, so first off, we'll hit on the individual scoring for Lumicyano. So when you first see this graph, you see three lines of 0, but don't worry about that. For the most part, when you look at the scores, you see a lot of 3s, you see a lot of 4s. You see 1, 5, but for the most part, it's good. It's adequate results or pretty good results. But really, when we move on to cyanoacrylate, what you see is a lot more 5s, right? You see a 2, you see a couple 2s, but for the most part, we're working in that 4 or 5 range. So that tells me that the data we're getting, the prints we're developing, is not only good, or not only done at a very high quantity, but they're all really good too. And now comparative scoring. So what we do, I have a bunch of photographs side by side, and the comparative score is 2 dashes is Lumicyano is less optimal of a technique. So just go with cyanoacrylate for that. And then 1 dash is just slightly less, maybe you could use either or. 1 plus is it's slightly more optimal, so same kind of thing. And then 2 pluses is go with Lumicyano for that, And so let's first start off with our controls. So if you look on the left for our Lumicyano, the contrast is a little bit not great. But if you look at the bottom there, those are all ridges, right? And you even have some pores in there too. This is really good control right here. Graying out the image kind of ruins it a little bit, but when me and my internship supervisor sat down, we agreed that this is a really good control. But when you look to the right, Cyanoacrylate and Rhodamine 6G, that's a great control. You can follow those ridges. There's a lot of detail there. So this one's going to have to go, as terms of control, this one's going to have to go to cyanoacrylate. And now we move on to our non-porous surfaces. So our first plastic cup yielded really good results on both sides. First, let's start off with Lumicyano. So this is a palm print, right? So it's a little bit hard to compare to a fingerprint, but there's still a lot of detail. You can trace all those ridges. There's a little bit distortion, but for the most part, that's in good contrast. That's in good detail. I really liked this one. But when you move on to that cyanoacrylate fingerprint, you don't get much better than that, right? And when you're comparing to pretty much standard, you're going to give it to cyanoacrylate every time, right? There's great contrast there, great detail, great, you can follow the ridges, everything's there, right? So that's going to be another one for cyanoacrylate. Can you advance me, please? Thank you. And then we get to our second plastic cup, which again yielded really good results. If you look at the Lumicyano, it's a little bit blurred. That's my fault. But trust me, that's a really good print. Again, great contrast, great detail. You can follow the ridges perfectly. But we gave the edge to cyanoacrylate again because you do not get better than that, everything is there, which was really, really awesome. And then this is when our Lumicyano didn't perform well. When we got to the soda can, the print on the right, There's a good amount of detail there. There is some smudging. That's probably due to that practical aspect that I talked about earlier. But overall, when you compare it against nothing, it's obviously better, right? And now we'll move on to our semi-porous surfaces. So this is actually the one surface, the one result that's in Lumicyano's favor actually. So on the left here, we have it, the Lumicyano on our magazine cover, and it's really light, right? As I said, half, maybe not half, but a portion of that fingerprint is absorbed into that cover, right? So this is what was really only was left on that. And I know it's a little bit faded, but there's good detail there. There's good contrast. The contrast is actually a lot better than our cyanoacrylate counterpart, and that's why I gave the edge to Lumicyano. There's a lot more detail there. I can follow this print. I can't really follow that one. So, and then our cigarette cartons, yielded no result for Lumicyano. So this is just going to be cyanoacrylate flexing for these next two slides. But, there's the print I got for this first cigarette carton. This is what I was talking about when I mentioned semi-porous surfaces, right? You see there's a huge glop of detail missing from the center of that print, and that's because it got absorbed into that cigarette carton, right? Which is unfortunate, but you have good ridge detail on the top there. Me and Amanda, my internship coordinator, agreed that this was definitely a workable print, not great, but definitely could use some enhancement. Maybe we could use it. So this is in between that 2 and 3 range. But yeah, again, because Lumicyano yielded no result, we're going to give it to cyanoacrylate. And I think you guys know where this is going. Neither technique yielded a result for our second cigarette carton, so that's not really adequate. So now to get to time and cost comparisons. So when you look at time, when you work in a lab, you want to be efficient, right? You want to be working as quickly as possible, but still getting really good results, right? When you look at the total time that it took from the start of fuming to the end of photography, I saved slightly less than an hour with Lumicyano, which is huge, right? And it's developing these prints, labeling them, marking them up, and then photographing them. It's a long process, right? When you get to cyanoacrylate, and that's with 48 prints, it took just under 3 hours, right? So when you're analyzing, 6 pieces of evidence, normally you'll find a lot more than what I found. So saving an hour is huge, right? And then we look at the cost, and you're saving $268 every time you order, which is, again, that's a lot of money, especially when you have Worcester, who's not exactly the most funded crime lab, right? So saving money is extremely important. But this is a really good slide for Lumicyano. This is really good data to use in Lumicyano's favor, but it's that quality over quantity aspect that is very important, right? You're saving time, you're saving money, that's great. But if the results you're getting aren't as good, then it's kind of counterproductive. And now let's get to the limitations of Lumicyano. So number one, it's tedious, right? I'm sitting there counting out 53 drops for this experiment. But if you have a fuming chamber with a 2,000 liter that holds 2,000 liters, you're counting 130 drops. That's crazy. That's wicked complicated. And I was having trouble counting out 53. So I don't even want to think about counting out 130. Another big thing to mention, the Lumicyano I used was technically expired, but I ran multiple control groups, right, to make sure it worked. And at that beginning slide, when I showed you the powder and solution mixing, if you don't get an orange mixture and it turns more brown, that's how you know your product isn't working. And I didn't see that at all. So I'm still thinking this is pretty viable. And fading, speaking of which, fading is huge, right? So over here, all the way to the left, these aren't my photos. This is a lady that works at the crime lab. So let me use these to demonstrate fading. So this initial fingerprint all the way to the left was developed and shot on January 4th of 2023, right? Really good detail, really good contrast. I mean, it'd be hard to see with the glare, but that's a really good print, right? It was shot again 4 months later, and it's virtually gone. You see a couple ridges, a couple of good pieces of detail, but for the most part, there's nothing there, right? And that's not great. And then when you get to when I started, I took the same piece of evidence out, same piece of mock evidence, and threw it under a laser, and that print is gone, right? There's nothing there. But the good part is that you can refume, right? You can use this product again and refume, and the print is back, right? Maybe not as high as quality, but it's still back. This isn't great because if you were to work at an agency and you develop a Lumicyano, the results are there. That's fine. You can use that. But once the case goes to court, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years later, you might want to re-examine. You could look at your photographs. That's true. But if you wanted to take out that piece of evidence and look at it under the laser again, it's gone, right? Or if you switch agencies and somebody else needs to testify for you, they might want to look at that piece of evidence. Well, the print's gone, right? And you don't want to have to refume, because then if you refume, that time you saved, that's gone too, because it's going to take another hour, right? So my conclusion and recommendation. So with this comparative analysis, unfortunately, I was wrong. Cyanoacrylate and Rhodamine 6G definitely outperformed my Lumicyano product based off of just overall scoring and just the limitations taken into consideration. There's a lot less with cyanoacrylate. So I recommended that cyanoacrylate and Rhodamine 6G stay the standard, but I also recommended that they keep it in the toolbox, right? Because as I stated in the beginning of this presentation, a margin of error is huge, right? When it comes to handling of evidence, you want to be as careful as possible. And if you need to do a two-step technique where you're handling that evidence a lot, the margin of error is higher than when using Lumicyano. So big pieces of evidence, like big guns, like a shotgun, or even a cash register, which we ended up analyzing over the summer, that made me think of this slide. They're really wonky, they're awkward, they're hard to maneuver, right? And when you're dye staining, you're bringing that piece of evidence from the bench to the dye staining hood, back to the laser. It's a lot of handling. There's a lot of margin of error there. And so yeah. Now I open the floor up for any questions. No questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Wait. With the random.
Do I get captured in this one? Go ahead. Yeah, it's getting recorded.
When you were doing the random handling, did you try to control for that? Did you hand it to 3 different people, each item to 3 different people, and have them manipulate it for a minute solid? Or did you just pull things out of a doctor's office, like Popular Mechanics and Glamour magazine?
So the non-porous surfaces, I actually, so it was a can of LaCroix and 2 little plastic cups of water. I actually got people that worked in the lab to just drink the water and drink the LaCroix in a very practical sense, just while they're working. So to keep it as practical as possible. When it came to the semi-porous things, nobody in the office smoked cigarettes, so I had to outsource the cigarette containers. So in that case, yeah, they were kind of given to me by people that just had them like at the ready. Exactly. And the magazine cover, Amanda actually looked through it for like a half an hour. So, yep. Yeah, to make sure that I got at least like the potential for a lot of good results. So, yeah. Yes.
I have 2 questions. The first one is the lab going to incorporate your findings and how they proceed or impact their standard operating procedures going forward?
Yeah, so when I conducted this research, when I presented this for the latent print unit, they actually came up with the conclusion that they were probably not going to use it just because of these results. And they've run this procedure before and got pretty similar results. So this was kind of just like a confirmatory test. So yeah, no, they're not going to implement it. But.
And the second question was about reanalyzing evidence and the fading. And that was really an important point because when cases go to court, the defense has the right to ask for a reanalysis.
Right.
And so, they're gonna be looking at evidence that may have been analyzed several years in the past, and it's usually 4 years between
Oh, wow.
crime and courtroom for many cases, and sometimes longer than that if it's a cold case and they're developing a print. So, those observations are really important in terms of how long the medium
Right.
that's pulling the print up is gonna last.
Right. And in terms of like authenticity, it can be questioned again. Well, you're reanalyzing it again or re-examining it again.
That's right.
Then you don't want to have to run an entire separate procedure to be able to reanalyze.
That's correct, because then that will throw the original analysis
Right.
into jeopardy.
Exactly.
Excellent.
All right. I think we're good.